I really liked the gay parts, which, I mean, they like weren't gay, but like they were gay. You know what I mean? Hi besties, welcome. I hope you're doing well. Professor Sally is back. If you're new here, welcome. I have been doing this series where I read the most popular books from a certain decade in the 20th century, starting at 1900, and we're gonna go all the way through to 2000. And we're only in the 20s. Today I'm here to talk about the Roaring 20s. This is a decade I am particularly fond of in terms of aesthetics, in terms of vibes, not necessarily in terms of politics, but in terms of sheer fashion, presence of champagne, I'm vibing with the 20s, you know what I mean? I love reading because it provides literary context to a historical time period. Books are like tiny time capsules. The ways in which these books represent the time period that they were written in and the ways in which they don't. It's fascinating to me. I hope it's interesting to you. It was my favorite thing about English class growing up, and so I'm trying to bring a more fun English class vibe to the tube. These are the videos where I get to go really in depth and nerd out. If you've never seen one of these videos from me, I definitely recommend you go watch the first two first because they are sort of a linear narrative thing that's going on. But I always start with the historical context. So, Professor Sally, take it away. Professor Sally's just me with a sweater on. What was happening in the 1920s? Let's talk about it. The war is over. World War I, done, finished. American economy is booming. After 4 years of combat, the Allied powers won World War I in 1918. That includes the US, Britain, France, and a few other countries. But along with the end of the war came dramatic changes in, obviously, the economy, society, politics. Lots of stuff was in flux during this time period. There was also this mass movement of urbanization, which meant for the first time in history, there were more people living in cities in the United States than in rural areas. This dramatically affects communication, transportation, interaction between the classes, things like this. Everything is getting much closer together and happening at a much faster rate because we're urbanizing, we're in the cities. Along with this urbanization came a lot of industrialization. There's lots of new technology going on. There's this massive push for factory-made goods and mass production of goods. This consumer culture was really appealing to the people of the time. And capitalism was thriving, is what I'm trying to say. Women got the right to vote in 1920. Big win. However, important to note that most Black women and a lot of Black men still could not exercise their right to vote because of voting restrictions all across America. But women's suffrage did encourage a more liberated form of woman in society, which is often represented by the flapper when we talk about the 20s. Flappers were sort of the extreme end of this liberation for women in terms of their dress and their behavior. Most women weren't as progressive as the flappers were, but it has stood the test of time as a symbol from history that demonstrates this changing moment for women. Hems were getting higher, curse words were flying, women were smoking and drinking, all things that previously were considered unladylike. During the war, a lot of women entered the workforce because so many men were on the front lines, and a lot of those women stayed in the workforce, as well as more droves of women deciding to enter the workforce. This was a time when a lot of women were leaving the domestic sphere of the home that had so long been where they were relegated, and they were branching out into the world of the workforce. In addition, birth control was becoming more widely available, which is great because when you have birth control, you can have as much depraved, frivolous sex as you want without having children. And that depravity and frivolity and hedonism of the 20s is something that a lot of lawmakers were trying to fight against. And how did they do that? Prohibition. The dark days. Prohibition was actually a constitutional amendment that made the sale and production of alcohol completely illegal. They really thought that banning alcohol would tone down the hedonism, but they were incorrect. There were a lot of unintended consequences that came along with prohibition. Instead of being regulated and sold to people, it was just being produced and sold under the table, unregulated and illegally. This led to a huge rise in bootleggers and even mobsters. A lot of famous mobsters were bootleggers at the time, and that's how they gained gained so much wealth and power. More people had more disposable income in the 20s, which led to people spending money on a lot of things that would have previously been considered frivolous, and people were spending more money on pleasure. There was money being absolutely funneled into the film industry, the fashion industry, the radio industry, the automobile industry. Dancing and jazz were massive pastimes during the 20s, thanks to the Harlem Renaissance and the amazing art that Black Americans were producing. However, just because white people were indulging in Black creativity and Black art does not mean they were not still racist. I want to make that very clear. One of my favorite quotes I found while doing research for this video is that F. Scott Fitzgerald himself once said that the 20s were the world's most expensive orgy. So maybe they were a little depraved. Black Americans were rapidly moving northward during the Great Migration, hoping to find that the North was less racist than the South. But really what they found was that those ideals were deeply entrenched in the North as well. Because of the economic boom and the end of the war, a lot of middle-class Americans believed that they had the opportunity for upward mobility. And they spent this decade reveling in the idea of that possibility, that freedom, and that pleasure before, in the next decade, everything came to a screeching halt with the Great Depression. That's just a little overview about what's going on in the 20s. All of that will significantly inform the books that I'm going to read for this video. History lesson's over. I gotta take this off. It's too hot. Let's talk about the books. As always, I'll be reading these books in chronological order to try to figure out if there are any overarching themes or changing narratives throughout the decade. I will be starting with The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This book was published in 1920, but it's actually set in the 1870s, which I did not realize. It's a super critical retrospective on the stuffy, rigid society of the late 1800s, especially in New York and especially in upper class New York. So this book I think will be a portrait of before the war, and it'll be kind of cool to start with that and then see how things changed after the war. It follows a community in what Wharton termed Old New York that is completely committed to this old society, committed to stasis, unwilling to change in any way. I do know that this follows a woman who's sort of on the outskirts of society, or like has done something that makes her a pariah or something like that, and I think our main character is a man and they meet, stuff ensues. I don't know, I'll find out when I read it. This book is also an example of modernism apparently, and I do love modernism. It's one of my favorite eras. We'll see how that one goes. Next, I will be reading This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, also published in 1920. It was Fitzgerald's first published work and also his most commercially successful before his death. This is semi-autobiographical, and Amory Blaine is thought to be a loosely veiled interpretation of F. Scott Fitzgerald himself. And this book is supposed to depict the frivolity that young people were for the first time engaging in during the 20s in terms of things like drinking and kissing casually, like not when you're committed to marry somebody forever, like, oh, the devil will get ya. I think it's gonna be a fun time. I already know I love Fitzgerald's language, so as long as the plot is halfway decent, I think I'll get on with this one. Next, I will be reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I don't know much about this except that it follows one woman throughout one day in her life. This was published in 1925, and it's set in Britain, which I didn't realize until I started making this video. And I'm trying to do mostly American lit in this video because when talking about the political culture of a country, I'm talking about the one I'm familiar with, which is my own. So that was an accident, but I've been meaning to read more Woolf, and I was like, might as well keep it on here. It is like so iconic and so classic that I feel like it'll still have something in it for me and for this video. This was like one of the first really popular stream of consciousness novels, and it flows in and out of our main character, Mrs. Dalloway's experience and memories, and then into other characters that she comes across during her day. The only Woolf I've read is A Room of One's Own, and I really loved it, but that was nonfiction. This is fiction. It's gonna be a different Virginia that I'm gonna be getting to know. Next, I'll be rereading one of my favorite books of all time, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now listen, this is sort of an extra one in this video because I can't do this video and not read The Great Gatsby. I think it's such an incredible depiction of the 20s, and it really like blows to pieces some of the things that Americans thought and believed in the 20s. And F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda were prescient enough to be able to sort of pick some of those things apart that other people bought into for free. And I think that's pretty cool. But this is a bit of a cheat because this book was not popular in the 20s. In fact, it was considered a flop. Everybody was like, wow, F. Scott Fitzgerald really flopped with that one. It became popularized during World War II when a lot of books were sent over to soldiers as a form of entertainment and escape. And The Great Gatsby was one of them. And the soldiers really loved it. And then it became wildly popular in the US and it's been taught in high schools ever since. But in my opinion, this is the great American novel, completely criticizing and pulling apart the lie that is the American dream. So you could say I'm cynical. It depicts the Jazz Age in all its abundant glory, but goes below that surface level luxury and looks at the heart and mind of America at the time, which was not doing as well as the dancing would have you believe. We'll talk more about this at the end once I've reread it. And last, the South's favorite American writer, William Faulkner. I'm reading The Sound and the Fury. This was published in 1929. I've read this one before, but it was in high school and very disjointed because I missed some of the classes where we talked about it, and I think I ended up having to spark note some of it. It was a mess. So I don't even consider myself having read this, but I know that it will feel really familiar when I dive in. Definitely a modernist text in terms of its form. Its actual written form is so weird and strange and difficult. It's gonna take me a minute to read this one. This is all about the South and the Southern aristocracy after the Civil War. It's set from about 1910 to 1928, but we have memories going back before then, and it follows the Compson family, who are representative of the American Southern aristocracy, and we're gonna look at their downfall after the Civil War. And I'm intrigued, I'm ready. Insane family dynamics, Southern Gothic lit. It's gonna be a roller coaster. I got a lot of reading to do and a lot of champagne to drink. I might as well get in the spirit of the thing, am I right?
One eternity later.
I've read the books. Let's go. Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I DNF'd this, I will not lie. I understand what it was trying to say and I appreciate what it was trying to say, but it didn't say it in a way that clicked with me. The audiobook was so bland and dry, but the text was even drier. I have already sent it to my local used bookstore, so I don't have a copy to hold, but we can still talk about the themes and how relevant it is to the decade. I actually think this book is a great way to start this video, even though I didn't finish it, because I got that glimpse into how society was before the war, and the massive difference between the society depicted in The Age of Innocence and every other depiction of society I read in this video is crazy. We follow Newland Archer, who is like an aristocrat. I don't even know what that word means. I just know that the Aristocats is a great film. And he is engaged to be married or about to be engaged to this one girl. But then Elena Olenska comes to town and she's getting a divorce from her husband over in Europe. And also she cheated on him, but also he was awful to her. There's a lot of stuff going down that I didn't fully understand because I'm not gonna lie, I was so bored. Sorry, I'm sorry. It is a book in which a lot of the main characters are fighting for change, but they end up being unable to follow through, and then they're sort of doomed by the fact that they're unable to change along with the changing world around them. We see this theme again later in The Sound and the Fury. This book also speaks a lot to the female experience of the time. Women were seen as needing protection. They were only seen as valuable if they were sexually pure, which we see a lot in the character of Ellen Olenska. And motherhood was seen as a woman's true purpose. This was really interesting to read about, especially in comparison with the other books that I read in which there were women characters who were entering into the world of sexual pleasure, who did not see their only purpose as motherhood. I really, really wanted to love it, but it just wasn't for me. But I get why it's important canonically, and I get why it is a great depiction of the time that Edith Wharton was writing about. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I really like this one. I annotated a bunch. It really made me think. I really liked the female characters in this book. I appreciated that this book was written about young people because all the time. Classics are just about freaking grown-ups. The young people were in flux in their livelihoods, just like the society and economy was in flux after the war. And so I think that that was paired really nicely together. The main character, Amory, talks a lot to Monsignor Darcy, and I really liked their discussions. They have sort of philosophical discussions, and Amory is able to talk to him about how his beliefs are changing. And like, yes, Amory is a very self-centered young white boy in the 1920s, but I really loved Fitzgerald's prose. His language is just so beautiful. So I had a good time with this one. There were so many great quotes. This is one of my favorite like quotes in an old classic I have found. This is Amory talking to Isabel and then her response. "Oh, don't be so darned feminine." Her lips curled slightly. "I'll be anything I want." One of the interesting things about this book in comparison with The Great Gatsby is that Fitzgerald still sort of critiques the shallowness of the 20s, but there's a lot less cynicism baked into this one from the get-go. This one had a little bit more of like a youthful, hopeful undertone, which was also really nice to see. And cool to see that progression of Fitzgerald's work. Way to go, F. Scott. Sucks as a person, but man, can he write a book. Next, I read Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Honestly, jail time for me. I need to stop doing that. This one was fine to me. I didn't love it, and by the end I was really ready for it to be over. There were certain characters and moments I really liked and certain ones I just could not be bothered to read about. This book and The Sound and the Fury especially are super fragmented. That style sort of wove itself into this decade, and that was a huge characteristic of modernist writing. We as the reader are sort of an omniscient presence that knows all because we flow in and out of different characters' minds, memories, realities, experiences, etc. Which is a little bit confusing at first because I didn't know that going in, and I was like, wait, who the hell are we talking about now? I do think that part of her purpose with the fragmented writing style was to sort of represent the ravaged Europe that existed after the war, how civilians were still sort of shell-shocked and traumatized from the war but had to go about their daily lives normally. I can appreciate that, I get that, but it just wasn't my fave book. Okay, let's talk about Gatsby. I honestly don't know how many times I've read The Great Gatsby in my life, at least 3 now, perhaps more. And it is truly one of my favorite books of all time. This was my favorite read of it so far, I think. I have never annotated a book this much. When I tell you I was annotating, I mean, girl, I was annotating. Like, who's really writing the novel? Is it F. Scott or is it me? God, it's just such a quintessential American text, and I know I'm getting really nerdy right now, but it's all about how the American dream is a lie and that the rich get richer and they don't face consequences for their actions, and the poor, even when they get richer, they face the biggest consequence of all, which is death. It's about how we expect too much from women. We don't expect enough from the American government. It's about how the capitalist system feeds you advertisements and messaging to make you believe that you are not enough as you are. They make you believe you have to have this new product or this much money or this kind of house. And until you have those things, you will be sad and lonely. This book shows that that is bullshit, because you can have all of those things and still be sad and lonely. So the trick is you don't buy into their shit in the first place. It's about not buying into capitalist bullshit. I would like one of those houses though. It shows the lack of upward mobility for middle class and lower class Americans. Daisy Buchanan and Tom Buchanan have wealth. They have old money. Their money's not drying up. They didn't have to work for it. Jay Gatsby, on the other hand, was poor. Instead of being able to work for the money that he earned, he had to earn it illegally through bootlegging schemes and selling alcohol to people during Prohibition. And he does all of it because he believes that if he makes enough money, if he gets the right house, if he moves to her city, Daisy Buchanan will still be in love with him. But it turns out she's more in love with money than she ever was with Gatsby. Daisy is the American dream, unattainable, but so nice to believe in. But also Daisy Buchanan is low-key a heartbreaking character too, because Gatsby is expecting so much from her. He's expecting her to leave her husband and start a new life with him, but she has a family and a daughter and a house that she loves and friends that she loves. That's just too much to ask of a person. Also so interesting the role the car plays in this book, because the car ends up being the downfall of all of the characters, and the car was super representative of the new industrialization and automobile age of America. There's so much cynicism under the pages of the superficiality, but there's also so much truth and heart in the pages with these characters, with Nick and with Gatsby. It breaks your heart because you start to believe in the lie too as a reader. I really recommend it. Me recommending like the most famous book of all time, like duh, okay, whatever. Okay, let's talk about The Sound and the Fury. This book has had my brain in knots since I finished it. There are vast sections with no punctuation. We go back and forth between italics and regular text. We go back and forth from timeline to timeline, but often without knowing where we've gone, and we just have to infer from context clues that we're in a new scene. Very difficult to read. It's mind-bending. It took me a while, and that being said, I am glad that I conquered it, because I think as a Southerner especially, it's a very interesting depiction of the downfall of the Southern aristocracy. We follow the children of the Compton family. That includes Quentin, Caddy, Jason, and Benji, who is severely mentally delayed. Our first section of the book, Benji is our narrator. So on top of switching timelines and everything, there are a lot of things that Benji can't comprehend because of his disability that we as the reader have to figure out on our own. But Benji also does understand a lot that the other characters don't because of the way that he sees the world. Our second section of the novel is narrated by Quentin, who is neurotic, and I think as a person with OCD, I think he probably has OCD. He is completely and utterly obsessed with his sister and her purity because he is clinging to those old Southern morals, and because he has this obsession with Caddy and Caddy's virginity, when she loses her virginity, he loses his mind. In his eyes, Caddy and her purity were the last remnants and representation of the old South, and when that is taken away from him, he doesn't know what to do because his family is an institution of the old South. The family is left to be run by Jason Jr., who is just an asshole. There's no other word for him. Actually, there's a lot of other words for him. He has no empathy or compassion for anybody else, and it shows. He is just so representative of the callousness of white people in the South at the time. Their family is falling apart. Every horrible thing that you could think of for this family to do, they probably do it. When I was reading it, I took from it that Faulkner was also, like Edith Wharton, critiquing the folks who were unable to change along with the landscape of the South after the war, and I thought it was a really interesting way to make this one family a microcosm of the entire South. This book explores the biggest topics of all big topics. It explores racism, moral purity, resentment of family, religion in the South, and familial tension in every sense of the phrase. It's very hard to talk about this book because it's so complicated and there's so much happening in it. It would take me years, I think, to like unpack everything that's going on in this book. This one is definitely a much closer look at what was going on during this decade in the South as opposed to in the cities and in New York. This is an entirely unpleasant read that is only rewarding once you've finished. Please, please, please take care while reading. Look up trigger warnings as always with all the books I recommend, but especially with this one. If you're not committed to like really doing the work that it takes to read this book, I would just skip it because I could not have read this without supplemental text from the internet. I read lots of essays about what was going on. Just know that going in if you decide to read this one. I did it. I'm so excited to move on to the Harlem Renaissance because Jesus, these books have been so white. I do love a good depiction of the 1920s, I cannot lie. It's nice to think that even for a night I could go to a party like Gatsby's and not worry about my station in the political landscape of the United States of America. But alas, it plagues me deeply in every moment. On that lovely note, I will ask you please to consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on bell notifications so that you don't miss any of my decades videos. There will be more to come. Comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if any of your favorite books were written in the 1920s. Like this video if you had a fun time frolicking through the Roaring Twenties with me. And if you want to be a supporter of the channel and join my monthly book club or my monthly Shakespeare book club, or both and get lots of extra live streams and a great Discord community. I will leave the link to my Patreon down below. So in case you haven't heard it today, I love you. Bye.